I want to say it's a little belated, but I want to say Chag Purim Sameach to everyone. And I wish everyone as many Hamantashen as they desire. And of course, we can all agree that poppy seed is the real Hamantashen and the only flavor that matters. So once we've agreed upon that, let's dive in. This is a 4-session course produced by Hadar, Project Zug. I'm going to start by asking everyone to put themselves on mute, and then we'll begin with the blessing. So if you can all mute yourselves, that would be great. Wonderful. Hi, Donna. Good to see you. Hey, Anita. Hi, Pat. And anyone else that I haven't specifically mentioned, it's good to have everybody here. Hi, Joel. Let's begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kedishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So this is really my pleasure. I get a lot of energy prepping for teaching. I get a lot of energy teaching, and then I use that energy in all kinds of interesting ways once we're done. And I hope that's the same for each of you. The focus this Zug is an interesting topic, and it's appropriately placed right before Passover. The topic, as produced by Dina Weiss, who curates the materials that we are going to use, the stories we tell and what stories tell us, storytelling on Passover and beyond. So I'm going to dive right in and share the screen. Okay, would you just nod if you can see that? Okay, good. So what I want to show you, first of all, I'm going to take a moment to look at the art. It's simple art, but it's on the front page of the text that you received. I'm going to pause there for a minute, and I'd like you, I can't see you very well, but I'd like if you would, just to look at that, and if that sparks any ideas to mind, what is that art about? Just unmute yourselves and go ahead and jump in.
It looks like the crossing of the Red Sea and leaving Egypt behind and walking towards a future.
Yes.
Of freedom.
Yes. You definitely have the parting of the sea. You definitely have an iconic picture, drawing of the pyramids. And what else is there, and why is it there?
The music.
Tell me about the music.
The music is there.
And what music is that?
Yes. Well, it's the music they sang when they crossed the Red Sea. That Rachel.
Miriam.
Thank you, Miriam. Phyllis. Yes. Thank you. Couldn't remember.
Good. So this is the song of Miriam, right? As everyone crossed the sea. And there's one more element to this rendering, which I want someone to, Archie.
It's a book.
It's a book.
It's an open book. And,
that's right.
The music and the sea and the pyramids are all actually coming out of the book.
Exactly. So from the pages of this book, once it is opened, the flood of water is there. The history is there. The joy and music are there. And that's the power of storytelling right there. You open the book and everything begins to flood out of you. Okay. So I want to stop for a minute. Let me do that. I'll come back to it.
Could I add one more thing to that?
Yes,
Diane?
Please.
It also looks like there's a teardrop in that book at the bottom. In the
middle
of the book, it looks like there's an element of a tear.
Let's go back to that. Does everyone see the teardrop? You see what we're talking about? Why would that be? What would be the symbolism of that?
Bitterness.
Maybe that's the bitterness, the sadness, the tears. What else could it represent? Any other ideas?
Not knowing what you're facing. You know what you have.
Interesting. What
So
else? Any other ideas?
A fear of the future, but joyousness in leaving what you had. So it could be a mixed fear.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Nancy.
Well, how could it be a tear of joy too? Tears of joy that we're singing, we're dancing. We've done this.
Yes. So the emotional ascription to
Every
that
emotion.
tear can be have a range to it. Similarly, with laughter, the emotional ascription to what the laughter means. Some people laugh because they're terrified, and some people laugh because they're happy or they heard something funny, but there's a range. Vera, did you have something? Yeah.
See, I don't see it as a tear. I see it as an international symbol of water. So I'm guessing it also has to deal with life.
Yes. Okay. I'm very interested in that comment because watch what we can do with that. Let's say that it's water and that it's placed right at the point at which the book is opened, almost as though the water is not only racing and rushing out, but it's also saturated in. So there is a saturation into the book itself, this book of stories that is our story. You guys are amazing. Any last comments before we take a look at the text? Okay. Well, let me know if you have a comment. I want to introduce the text that we have for today by saying that Jews are prolific storytellers. We have been storytellers all of our existence. In some ways, it is a defining characteristic of us to tell our story and to elaborate upon that story, to make that story relevant to the contemporary reality, to share that story with our children and our grandchildren, and if we're so fortunate, our great-grandchildren. But there is nothing new. There is everything rich and layered and saturated and old about Jews as storytellers. What's fascinating about what we're going to do for this session is take a look at storytelling in what I think is a unique and original way. It's not a contemporary way per se, because the storyteller was alive in the early 20th century. He actually perished in the Holocaust. This is a story. He's going to retell our story, part of our story, in a different way than I think we're used to. Backing up, many of you may be familiar with the idea of pardes, which is a way of telling stories that includes the peshat, that's the P, the remez, that's the R, par, the durash, that's the parde, and the sod, that's the pardes. Together, that's an acronym. But what we're talking about are different layers of storytelling, and each one builds upon the ones preceding it. So there's a literary plain meaning of the text. Let's just understand what is happening here. Who is involved? Where are they? What's the tension? What's the resolution? Those kinds of questions. Then there's remez, which is an allegorical reading of the text. What can this be in reference to? What might this actually be eliciting from us? Then there's drash, which is the one we might be the most familiar with, as in the term midrash, or let's give a drash. So that is figuring out, using various rules of comparison, contrast, interpretation, so that we have an elaboration of the text, sort of a filling in of the gaps of the text, but keeping our drash anchored in the literal meaning of the text, or let's say in the actual words of the text. And finally, there's sod, which is the mystical interpretation or more spiritual interpretation of the text. I'll give you an example. We will read the Song of Songs on Passover. That's the Megillah that we read during Pesach. And the Song of Songs is a love story. And it's losing love and looking for love and being in love and springtime and falling in love. But the mysterious reading of it, sort of the sod reading of it, is this is our relationship with God. The Jewish people in relationship with God is a marriage. It is a love story. Now, there's nothing in the text that says that, nothing. But that is a very traditional interpretation of the Song of Songs. So these layers build up on each other. But today we're going to take a look at a different way, an even different way of looking at the text that we're familiar with. So let me introduce the storyteller. If you had a chance to take a look at the handout, you'll see on the side margin, the storyteller is Rav Kalonimus Kalman Shapiro. And he was the head rabbi of a small town called Piaseczno in Poland. He was aware at that time that the secularization of the Jewish community was on the rise. And it concerned him that fewer and fewer students were diving into traditional Torah study, traditional text study.
Because I did have another little.
Okay. Hi, Edith.
Hi, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. You are appropriately garbed.
Well, it's Purim today.
Yeah, there you go. Edith, I'm going to ask you if you can put yourself on mute just so that we don't have the background
Sure.
noise. Thank you.
Really, because I've gotten chairs for. That's good.
There you go. Okay. So Rabbi Shapiro's idea was not to double down on the way Torah was taught, which was rigorous, authoritative, punitive, sometimes physically punitive. But what he decided to do instead, which got him into trouble, of course, with his compatriots, what he decided to do instead was, let me see if I can find this quote. This is by Rabbi Nehemiah Poland, who was a translator of Rabbi Shapiro's. Rabbi Shapiro argued that a child must be, quote, imbued with a vision of his own potential greatness and enlisted as an active participant in his own development. Likewise, teachers must learn to speak the language of the student and graphically convey the delights of a life of closeness to God. Rabbi Shapiro, writes Poland, argued for a positive, psychologically sensitive, joyous educational method. Sounds contemporary, doesn't it? This notion of using storytelling to awaken and express your imagination is not necessarily a traditional way of Jewish storytelling, and yet it complements every kind of storytelling that we know. So what we do, what Rabbi Shapiro is going to do in this story is tell us a piece of the Exodus story and then weave his own explanation of it. The explanation will be much longer than the actual verse he starts with. But that verse will be his starting point, the launching pad for an imaginative, midrashically literate weaving of a story with which we're all familiar. Keep in mind that he's living in Poland between the wars. He's active as a rabbi between the wars. He is captured and put into a concentration camp where he will perish. His work will be found in a milk can and translated by Nehemiah Poland. I'm going to bring up the text for you. There we go. There we go. Okay. And here we go. So the first paragraph of this text is Rabbi Shapiro speaking to his students. Then he dives into his story, and he begins his story, if you can see in the bold, with a verse from Exodus chapter 1, verse 14. And then he begins to play with it imaginatively. So here we go. When you study the Torah, he says to his students, try to participate in the holy events that happened as if you were also there when they were happening. Indeed, you don't know if it was truly thus the way that you imagine it, but aren't you thinking along the lines of the fundamentals that were stated in the Torah and the Midrash? You are only expanding upon them in your own thoughts. This is the unique part of it, that each individual, according to this teacher, has by right the opportunity to allow their imagination to run. Here's the quote from Shemot. They embittered their lives with hard labor, with mortar and bricks. All of the labor that they impressed them to do was oppressive. Labor, impressed, oppressive, same word. And here now he takes off. The cruel Egyptians didn't need the buildings. They only aspired to embitter their lives. And it is for this purpose they invented the need to build Pitom and Ramses. And any crazy and evil Egyptian, any good-for-nothing teen, would be brazen enough to curse or even beat an old and respected Hebrew man with frightening beatings to the point of breaking his bones or even killing him. Even if the Hebrew was stronger than him, he would be forced to suffer his strikes, because who would be able to stand up to an Egyptian who has the power to, God forbid, destroy them all in an instant? Even a bird can find a home, a nest for it where it can rest. But the Jew, after all his bitter labor, from the time of the cockcrow, and after all the beatings and the breaking of his bones all day, they wouldn't let him go home to rest. And he had to sleep in the field. And the mortar was his pillow, and the mud was his blanket. And many of them didn't know their children, and their children didn't know them, because so much time had passed since they stepped across their own thresholds. Rather, they spent their whole lives in the field, with mortar and bricks, being chased and beaten. I'm going to pause there and give us a chance to let that settle in, and I'll take any responses, immediate responses you have to that telling of the story. Nancy.
Ever thus. I mean, this is the history of the Jews. No matter how important we think we have become in any particular civilization, we end up in the field with the mud as a blanket and the mortar as our pillow. So this is this midrash, or whatever he terms it, is a story not only about the Exodus, but it's a story of Jews in history. So he's built upon the sentences a really complicated story that you can tell and retell no matter what year you look on the calendar. That's my reaction to it.
I agree. Yeah. Donna.
I think it creates the sensual experience that you don't get from the other words. And specifically, it paints a picture and you feel it viscerally in his description, which makes it much more real and potent.
I agree. I agree. Joel, I thought, were you going to say something?
Yeah, Donna basically captured it. It makes it very immediate, very understandable. One can see oneself being forced to be out in the fields, not knowing your children for long periods of time. It just makes it very real in anyone's life.
Absolutely. I thought I saw another hand also. Yeah, Tom.
Whenever I see stories about slaves, whether here in this story or in the United States when they were slaves, I always wonder why they're not treated well, in that they would work better and longer if they were treated well. And it's interesting because it almost any time when there are slaves successfully used, it's because it seems to be that there are so many replacements for them that it doesn't matter. But it's just always still a question in my mind.
So I want to stay with that, and then I want to go back to something that Nancy said. So if profitability is not the paramount goal, I mean, if profitability was the paramount goal, then you would want your servant class, your slave class, to be robust enough to produce for you. But if that's not the primary goal, and you are treating your slaves with utter abject cruelty, then what is the goal? Why do you do that? Why do you do that? Why do people do that? Yeah, Anita.
I think comes down to a simple 4-letter word, hate, H-A-T-E. There are haters in this world that don't care about. Tom has a pure heart because he can't see that when you hate, you don't care. You don't care about how you treat your slave. You just hate. And I think that it all boils down to hate. Look, when we had slaves, we were commanded to treat them in a moral way. But haters have no morals.
And yet we know that whatever one group of people is capable of, another group of people is capable of. We learned this in some experiments after the end of the Holocaust, where people were, randomly assigned, normal people were randomly assigned to various roles as prisoner or guard keeper and told what to do. And they fulfilled those roles to the maximum degree of aggression. And even when those roles then were reversed, they fell back into those roles and repeated them with maximum aggression. And these were common people taken randomly. We know that we are capable of anything that anyone else has done for the good and for the cruel. I want to go back to something Nancy said. And also, of course, you can challenge me on the point I just made. But I want to go back to something that Nancy said. Any point in history, many, many times in history. So this particular story, as unfolded by Rabbi Shapiro, could be overlaid upon many, many, many historical moments. What if we overlaid it upon his particular historical moment? In what ways does it seem to elicit a response, I'm guessing, a response from Rabbi Shapiro of the predicament that he finds himself in? Do you see links? I'll share with you one, and then, yes, Eileen.
Subjugation.
Okay, play that out. Tell me what you mean.
Even today within our society and in every society that you can ever study, there's a group of people, whether it's by eye color, skin color, monetary wealth, lineage, subjugates others for power, for greed.
So if we place that idea atop the historical time period between the world wars and into World War II, which is his lifespan, we see it playing out. Here's something else we see playing out. He writes that it didn't matter if you entered Egypt as a noble person or a person of stature. And he is rallying against secularization of the Jews of Poland, who honestly, and the Jews of Germany as well, had risen to positions of comfort and some authority, and really felt as though they were too far above the common person to be injured. They were not vulnerable to this. And in his telling, he's clear about saying that doesn't matter how you enter, you will be subjugated. And I can hear in that his warning to the Jews of Poland. Don't think for a minute that if they're coming after the Jews, they're not coming after you, which of course is an essential teaching of the book of Esther. All right? Don't think for a minute that because you're in the court of the king, that you will be somehow saved. You will not. Eileen, back to you.
Yeah, I can't help but jump into thinking about China, particularly when they had the re-education programs, or are having still with minority groups, the re-education programs. And I think about those who I know who are here, who are arrogant because they've achieved such financial success. And, but they're one step above failure always, should something happen, it appears to me. So
I love it. I think it's just a universal cautionary tale. Don't think that the robes you wear protect you from the realities of human behavior. They do not. Okay. Any other comments before? Yeah, Nancy.
I think, well, my theory is that inherent within humanness, being human, is humans always need an other, somehow to feel that they're special, or that someone's threatening them, so they are other and they are a danger and evil. So it's part of the power dynamic that people do search for power or consider certain activities to be powerful. But I think there's something inherent that we must overcome to always seek out the other. And Jews have always been the easy foil to be the other because there are not many of us and we're different. But I think in a lot of dynamics, the Chinese with the Uyghurs, it's looking for someone who's different enough that you can blame them for all your own ills. So you found your others. And somehow I think there's something in human, people can say there's something you learn, but I think it's more than that. And it's something to be overcome. If it were just something taught, that's one thing, but I think there's something inherently bad that we have as part of our nature, seeking out the other.
I could play with that forever, Nancy, in terms of the evolution of the human mind and human character. Anyone who has taught elementary school students sees this at a very, very young age. Then the question is, what will the students who are participating in this, and what will the students who witness this behavior, what will they all learn based upon the adult's response? And if the response is a free pass, they learn one thing. And if the response is a way to resolve differences peacefully, they will learn something else. But the natural attempt to rise above someone else, to raise your position by lowering someone else's, it's there. It's there. Tom, you had a comment.
We're talking about Israel today with those who are in power, and though the victims are us, the non-ultra-Orthodox, as well as the Palestinians.
So having said that, if you have not yet read Rabbi Caruso's essay in the bulletin about Israel and the current struggle in Israel, it's a very important essay to read all the way through. Okay, I'm going to take the text a little bit further. And a second. Actually, we'll take it to the end. Here we go. Okay. The hearts of the cruel ones were not satisfied that the Hebrews were disgusting in their eyes on account of the labor with mud and bricks. But they furthermore made the Jews who came to the land as nobles into sweepers of the streets and markets. The Israelites were lowly and disparaged in their eyes. Indeed, they had received from their fathers, and their fathers received from their fathers, that they were not slaves from the womb and from birth. They came here as officers and rulers. And their ancestor Joseph was second to the king and saved all of Egypt from death and destruction. But there is no mention of Joseph or any of their other elders who dealt kindly with the Egyptians. Their one thought was to depress Israel and to crush them. But behold, Moses, our teacher, and Aaron, the priest, entered into this suffering, and the voice of God was calling through them. I have noticed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I say that I will bring you up out of all the suffering of Egypt into a land flowing with milk and honey. This is the second of two verses from the text that anchor his entire drash. And the man would come to his home and tell his wife and children about all of the great and wondrous things that he heard and that he saw with his eyes, speaking and describing before them how their departure from this will look and how they should prepare themselves for the journey. And there will be an innocent child who asks out of fear, my father, my mother, how are we going to get out? The oppressor is going to beat us. Please remember, my father, how when you were so remiss, so as to just stand up, this evil person beat you so. For how many weeks were you ill after that? How many nights did you roll around in your agony? I'm afraid. And the father would yell at him, saying, could this oppressor possibly harm us at the time that God's will has arisen to save us? And the child cried greatly. His mother, who was among the righteous women in Egypt, took him into her arms, and she kissed him and said to him, listen, my son, my beloved, please listen. Do not cry, my dear. Didn't I teach you from your childhood to know that the God of Israel is God? He created the heavens and the earth, the seas and the rivers. He made everything according to his will, and everything is guided by his will. There is nothing that is beyond his ken, even in the depths of the earth or the bottom of the sea. He created everything, sees everything, and everything he guides. Okay. So obviously that's a selection of the story as retold by Rabbi Shapiro. Comments on that section? Nancy?
I have one comment. The use of the word Israelites and Israel in that, because they were not Israelites yet. They were just Jewish, the Jewish people. And we know that they don't, they talk about the Israelites, and it confuses me.
So at the risk of confusing you further, let me say this. When our people were in Egypt, we were known as Hebrews. That's who we were. Now, we descended from Jacob, Yisrael, right? But we were known as a people as Hebrews. The term Jew does not come into place until the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the exile of the elite to Babylon. Those were primarily from the tribe of Judah. And when those Yehudim, Jews, returned, we became Jews. Israelite takes on another slice of history because the temple was built by Solomon during the first Commonwealth. And when the Hebrews had their first Commonwealth, they became Israelites. Okay, of course, then there's a split, and you have Israel taking the name for the northern tribes, Judah taking the name for the southern tribes, so it's complicated. But one thing we do know, they were neither Israelites per se, historically, and they certainly weren't Jews back in Egypt. So when the rabbi uses the term Jews, especially, he's sort of conflating history to make a point. Comments on that or anything? Yeah, sure.
I think I'm going back to the first paragraph in which Moses is included in these people that were enslaved. I don't think he grew up living an oppressed life, right, since he was adopted and lived a pretty good life. So I just find it a little ironical, maybe. You know.
Yeah, he was taken, obviously, he was drawn from the river by Pharaoh's daughter when he was still a baby. There is no way that he had a memory of his birth mother or father or family. He grows up in the palace. He grows up with all of the accoutrements of royalty. And yet, when he sees a Hebrew slave being beaten, something is awakened in him and causes him to intervene. Whatever that was, he begins to realize that his real birth, his real origin, is within this people. These are his people. So for anyone who's worked with students who are or kids who are adopted or who knows about adoption, that moment of understanding that he is not of royal blood, that he is in fact of Hebrew blood, I'd love to have a drash that would fill in some of those gaps. Other comments on this section, the section especially I want to get to before we have to conclude, about the child's response to the father coming in and saying, there's wondrous things, and God will provide for us. And the child's response is really extreme and he's terrified. Comments on why, what does that mean? Why would Rabbi Shapiro have the child? In Rabbi Shapiro's mind, the child is not going to accept this as we're saved. Far from it. Why? What's that about? Yeah, sure.
Okay, so going back to the beginning of the story, most children didn't grow up knowing their fathers. And it was the father's obligation to pass down the history, the religious history, the life history to these children, so that they may have not been as fully educated. I'm not sure if there were people that were teaching them this or the mothers. So when this father comes home and says, we're saved, the kid's like, what? What are you telling us? How is this possible? All I've known my whole life is you're being beaten.
Yes.
You're at home being beaten. I too will one day be out there and be beaten just for being Jewish.
Yes.
And he might not know the full extent of God and the history of the relationship with the Jews. So how is he supposed to believe this man who can't even protect his family and believe that there's a better life for them to come?
Yes. Yes. Very interesting. So again, Wendy, did you have your?
I think it also goes back to Tom's question about why do oppressors treat their slaves so badly? That it also just has to do with power and fear, and that if you can indoctrinate people with fear and with always feeling vulnerable, then you can have your way with them.
Yes.
Whatever that means.
Yes. And this fear, which the child is expressing, if If you take the passage in the text that talks about the slaves being unable to cross the threshold of their own homes, so that they barely knew their children and their children barely knew them, that's devastating right there. Lay on top of that Poland in the 1930s, where things are getting progressively dangerous and limited for Jews. And a child who might see their father, who now is crossing the threshold, right? We've left Egypt in the mind of Shapiro. I see us having left Egypt. Now we're in Poland, and the father is crossing the threshold and saying, it's going to be fine. God is with us. God is aware. But the child's sole experience is that the one time his father stood up, he was beaten to the point of agony and writhing in bed for many days. Which teaching should he believe? The teaching of his mother, the teaching of his father, the hopefulness that they are offering him, the experience that he had witnessing his father, his protector, the strongest person probably that he knows, being beaten so severely. Yeah, Eileen.
You know, we go back to the Holocaust as such a horrific example, but I'm thinking of before Ellis Island was renovated and turned into a different kind of museum. It used to be divided into galleries, and each gallery was the American posters and advertisements about each group that was coming in, and relegated them to rats and dogs and whatever vermin you would want to think of. It still happens. You know, it was happening here with this Statue of Liberty waving her torch, right? And I think about the children who came and said, is this the better life? When, you know, no dogs or Jews allowed, no blacks, dogs or Jews allowed kind of thing. And even in universities or corporate beings or escalating in neighborhoods, there was still limitations. So what someone said, I forget who it was, about everyone needing to subjugate others to feel important and protect their sense of their community is still very viable.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, so I want to make a couple of comments before we need to close. And there is no way I'm leaving this group with such weighty, heavy, difficult thoughts. So let's see if we can somehow pull this in a more uplifting direction. First of all, I think that the layering of Rabbi Shapiro's story onto the Exodus story is a piece of loving kindness that we do every Seder. Every Seder, we talk about difficulties in our current time, difficulties in our grandparents' time. We talk about ways in which we overcome difficulty. So I think that his version of storytelling is fascinating, and I think that the content of this particular story that he weaves together is fascinating. Secondly, I will say that while there's a certain weight in our country and in many countries around the world globally, there's a certain weight of a movement towards oppression and towards authoritarianism. This is the time to believe what Shapiro's father brings in across the threshold in the latter part of this telling. If we concede, if we get too exhausted, if we say it's not possible, it's too hard, we're only a small people, if we say any of those things, we open ourselves up not only to devastation, but to sort of a moral shriveling. And what this time really requires of us, and maybe we can bring this to our Seders, is a recognition that we actually have known democracy and liberalism and possibilities and free speech and freedom from want for many of us. We know this. We will fight for this in whatever ways we have at our disposal. And one of those ways is talking to our families during the Passover Seder and offering the hope that we will continue to articulate the values we hold so dear in the ways that we can do that through our work in tzedakah, through our prayers, through our writings, through our conversations. We will stand for the highest values that Judaism offers to us and which we've had the privilege of living with, most of us, for most of our lives. Comments on that before we say goodbye? Donna, yeah.
I certainly agree. And I think there has to be a vision. And I think that that's part of storytelling, right? There has to be conflict and there has to be vision and there has to be heroes. And I think that he presents all three of those in a very compelling way. And I also like the way the conflict is set up, that it's not either that everything's going to be fine and you just have to have faith, or that we're doomed. It's, you have to stand up, and that's scary. That's some scary stuff, but it's important to do it anyway.
And if you remember that he wrote many of his works while he was in the concentration camp and saved them in a milk can, which allowed them to be discovered. So in that situation, he did not fold. Okay. Yeah, Nancy and then Tom.
In the Haggadah, it says that we should read these stories as if we ourselves came out of Israel.
Out of Egypt.
Out of Egypt, I'm sorry. Yes, out of Egypt. And I think it goes down generation to generation to generation to generation. So if you're saying that we ourselves were saved in Egypt, then we ourselves were saved from the Holocaust. And hopefully but not by now, we ourselves can do something to speak up and save ourselves by this
Absolutely. Tom, I think you had your hand up, and then Phyllis, you'll get the last word.
Yeah, what Donna said made me think of something. It's just on how you look at God, and one way is belief that God is and whatever has ultimate control. So God as a baseline belief, and the other is God representing hope. And when you have hope, it's not ultimate confidence, but it's positive.
Agreed. Phyllis, bring it home.
Having just come or being part of Purim, we can look at it another way, because God is not mentioned in the Purim story, and it's our own human devices that were salvation. And I think that's taking the Purim story and now moving 4 weeks later or a month later to the Passover story. It emphasizes our role of salvation.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining in today. I want to encourage everybody to join in next Wednesday as well. Stacey will send out the link and the link to the page. And my final wish is that you all stay very healthy and have one last Hamantashen. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week.
Beautiful close, Diane.
Thank you.
Diane.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks.
Bye.